You are led through a gate the city outside does not know exists. Not the main gate of the compound. Not the gate that petitioners use. A smaller, plainer door set into a wall that runs farther than you expected. And on the other side of it, the world stops sounding like a city at all. No carts. No merchants shouting prices. Only water moving somewhere close, and birds you cannot place, because you have never seen them outside a cage. You have just stepped into the private garden of a great noble household during the age of the Seven Kingdoms, somewhere between the 5th and 3rd centuries before our era. And you are about to learn something most visitors to ancient China never imagine. This quiet, beautiful place was never built for peace. It was built as an instrument of power, assembled from water, earth, and rare trees instead of bronze and iron. And the people who built it often paid for its beauty with their backs, and sometimes with their lives. Most people picture the Warring States period as armies and sieges, as the slow grinding contest between Qin, Chu, Wei, Zhao, Han, Yan, and Qi that ended with one empire swallowing 6 kingdoms. Almost no one pictures the gardens, and yet behind nearly every palace wall, in every capital from Linzi to Handan to Ying, lords and ministers were pouring fortunes into walled parks that had almost nothing to do with flowers. These were terraced, animal-stocked, water-laced demonstrations of who could outspend, outbuild, and outlast their rivals. And in a world where ritual still claimed to limit what a lord was allowed to construct, every garden was also a small act of defiance against the old order that was crumbling around everyone. To understand why a garden could be dangerous, you first have to understand what these spaces actually were. Long before the 7 kingdoms tore each other apart, Chinese rulers had already been building enclosed parks called yu, walled hunting grounds where kings and nobles chased deer and birds, and where orchards and vegetable plots fed the household. By the centuries of the Warring States, these enclosures had grown far more elaborate, organized around raised earthen platforms called tai, terraces that could rise several stories into the air, built level by level from packed earth and faced with timber halls and painted towers. A terrace was not simply a viewing platform. In the oldest layer of Chinese belief, height itself was sacred, a place where a ruler stood closer to heaven, where ancestors could be addressed, where the movements of stars could be tracked. Whoever built the tallest terrace was not just showing off. They were making a claim about their closeness to the cosmic order itself. This is the detail almost no documentary mentions. Terraces were originally supposed to be restricted. Under the old Zhou ritual system, certain heights and certain types of platform were reserved, at least in theory, for the Zhou king alone. When a regional lord built a terrace that rivaled or exceeded what ritual allowed, it was not decoration. It was a public structural insult to the crumbling authority of Zhou, a way of saying in earth and timber that the old rules no longer applied to you. By the Warring States period, nearly every kingdom had at least one of these monuments. The state of Wei had its Wentai, the patterned terrace. Han had its Hongtai, the grand terrace. Qi had its Lukentai beside the royal hall in its capital at Linzi. And in Handan, capital of Zhao, King Wu Ling, the same ruler famous for forcing his court to abandon long robes for the trousers and mounted archery of the northern horsemen, built a terrace later remembered as the Kongtai, where he reviewed troops and watched music and dancing performed for assembled guests. Long stripped of its original timber halls, an earthen mound bearing that name still rises in the heart of modern Handan, in Hebei province, inside what is today called Kongtai Park, one of the very few garden terraces from this era whose location has never been in doubt. Walking one of these private gardens in its prime meant walking through layers of sound and sight that no city street could offer. Geese and wild ducks moved across ornamental ponds. Deer, sometimes herds of them, both the large stag and smaller doe varieties prized for their tameness, grazed in fenced clearings, watched by keepers whose entire job was managing the moods of animals that nobles liked to feel they had personally tamed. Fish and turtles filled the ponds, not as food on most days, but as something closer to moving decoration. Creatures to be watched rather than eaten, which mattered more than it sounds. In the philosophical writings gathered under the name of the thinker Zhuangzi, there is a famous scene of two men, Zhuangzi and his friend Huizi, strolling along a bridge over the Hao River and arguing about whether a man on a bridge could possibly know whether the minnows swimming beneath him were happy. It almost certainly did not happen inside a noble's private park. The Hao was an open river, not a garden pond. But the scene captures exactly the kind of leisure these spaces were designed to manufacture. Educated men wandering slowly beside water, watching fish, talking about the limits of what one mind can know about another life. Garden ponds existed to produce that exact mood on command, for whoever could afford to build one. This is the part most people never imagine about ancient luxury. That the most expensive thing a warring state's lord could buy was not silk or bronze. It was the appearance of effortlessness. A garden that looked natural, where deer wandered, where fish leapt, was in fact a wildly artificial machine requiring constant human labor to maintain. Gardeners pruning the same trees year after year, herders moving animals out of sight before a guest arrived, servants raking paths so that footprints disappeared and the place looked untouched by anyone but birds. The nobles who walked through these gardens rarely saw the labor that produced the illusion. That invisibility was the entire point. But the gardens that left the deepest mark on history were not the well-managed ones. They were the gardens built by rulers who could not stop. The most infamous example comes slightly before the Seven Kingdoms had fully crystallized, in the southern state of Chu. But its shadow stretched across the entire era that followed and shaped how every later king thought about garden building. In the year usually dated to 535 before our era, King Ling of Chu completed a terrace palace called Zhanghua, near what is today Qianjiang and Jianli County in Hubei province. Modern archaeologists excavating the site between 1999 and 2001 identified 22 separate rammed earth platform foundations across an enormous area, with the central terrace itself rising roughly 23 meters high and 35 meters wide. Large enough that ancient writers said visitors needed 3 separate stops, 3 landings, simply to climb to the top. King Ling had recruited landless refugees to build it, a detail recorded almost in passing in ancient sources, as though forcing displaced, propertyless people into construction labor for a pleasure palace required no further comment. He also demanded tribute from the lords beneath him. Ornate ceremonial bells, rare woods, skilled artisans, funneling the wealth of an entire regional hierarchy into one man's terrace. A minister named Wuju, whose criticism survives in the ancient text known as the Discourses of the States, condemned the project directly, describing how the king and his court treated the height of the earthworks, the beauty of the painted towers, the magnificence of the bells and chimes, and the noise of the assembled crowds as sources of pure pleasure, as though the suffering required to produce that pleasure were simply invisible to the people enjoying it. Wuju was not wrong to worry. Within a few years, while King Ling was away besieging a rival state and camped far from his capital, a coup erupted at home. His sons were killed, his ministers turned against him, and the king who had built the most spectacular terrace garden in the history of Chu, to that point, died abandoned, hungry, and alone. Far from the towers he had forced an entire kingdom to raise for him. It would be easy to read that story as a simple morality tale, and several ancient writers did exactly that. The philosopher Mencius, writing a century or more later in the courts of the warring states proper, used gardens as one of his sharpest tools for talking about what made a ruler legitimate. In a passage from his recorded conversations, Mencius visits King Hui of Liang. Liang being another name for the state of Wei after it moved its capital to Daliang, the city now called Kaifeng, in Henan province. The king is standing beside his own garden pond, watching geese and deer, and he asks Mencius whether a wise and good ruler can also take pleasure in such things. Mencius answers that a virtuous ruler can, and a corrupt one cannot, even with the very same animals in front of him. He reaches back centuries earlier to King Wen of the Zhou, whose people, according to the old poems, built his terrace and his pond using their own labor and were happy to do it, calling the terrace and the pond marvelous, delighted that their king had deer and fish and turtles to enjoy, because he had shared the wealth of the kingdom with them, rather than hoarding it. Mencius then contrasts this with the tyrant Zhao, the legendary last ruler of the Jia dynasty, whose subjects hated him so completely that they wished to die alongside the very sun itself, rather than live another day under him. And even though Zhao too had towers, ponds, birds, and animals, none of it brought him a single moment of real pleasure, because pleasure built on resentment, in Mencius's account, was never pleasure at all. What makes this genuinely fascinating, and rarely discussed outside specialist scholarship, is that the garden itself in these stories is morally neutral. The exact same pond, the exact same deer, the exact same fish could be a symbol of shared prosperity or a monument to tyranny, depending entirely on how it had been built and who had been forced to build it. A warring state's garden was never just a garden. It was a verdict, rendered in trees and water, on the character of the person who owned it. And everyone walking through one, noble or servant, philosopher or spy from a rival court, understood that they were reading a kind of testimony every time they crossed a bridge or admired a terrace. This is also where the gardens of the warring states quietly connect to something most people never associate with this era at all: the early roots of China's obsession with immortality. 4th century texts collected under the title Classic of Mountains and Seas describe a mountain called Pengalai, somewhere in the Eastern Sea, home to immortal beings, its palaces built of gold and silver, jewels growing on its trees like fruit. This was myth, not garden design. In the Warring States period itself, no king of this era is reliably recorded building an artificial mountain and pond complex to represent it. But the idea was already circulating in the same intellectual world that produced Mencius and Zhuangzi, planted decades before the philosophy of garden cosmology would fully bloom under later emperors obsessed with the same myth. The seed of an idea that would eventually consume enormous resources under the first emperors was already growing quietly in the same soil as these terraces, long before anyone called it an empire's business. By the final century of the Warring States period, garden building among the major lords had become something close to an arms race conducted in earth and timber rather than iron. Every kingdom wanted a terrace that announced its wealth to visiting envoys before a single word of diplomacy was spoken. A foreign minister walking into Linzi, capital of Qi, or into Handan, capital of Zhao, would be led past these structures deliberately, on a route chosen to maximize the impression of bottomless resources, before ever reaching a negotiating hall. The garden was, in this sense, the opening move of every alliance, every threat, every marriage negotiation between rival courts. It told a visitor everything they needed to know about whether the kingdom hosting them could outlast a siege, outspend a rival, or simply outwait an enemy's patience. And then it all stopped mattering, almost overnight, kingdom by kingdom. As Qin's armies absorbed the 6 remaining states between 230 and 221 before our era, the private gardens of dozens of noble households across the conquered territories lost their purpose in an instant. A terrace built to intimidate a rival court meant nothing once that rival court no longer existed. Some gardens were destroyed outright in the fighting that accompanied conquest. Others were simply abandoned, their keepers scattered, their deer let loose or taken, their ponds left to silt up and fill with reeds within a generation. The rammed earth cores of these terraces proved remarkably durable, durable enough that 22 centuries later, archaeologists could still map their outlines beneath modern Hubei farmland. But everything that had made them gardens rather than dirt mounds, the trees, the animals, the music, the meaning, vanished almost completely, leaving only the bones of the architecture for later generations to puzzle over. What disappeared with the fall of the 7 kingdoms was not simply a set of pretty parks. It was an entire vocabulary, a shared competitive language of terraces and ponds that regional lords had spent centuries developing to speak to one another without speaking. Qin's unification replaced that vocabulary with something far more singular. A state where eventually only one person's gardens would matter at the scale these lords had once competed at, where the entire architectural conversation collapsed into a monologue. What was gained in the most narrow sense was efficiency, and eventually a tradition of imperial garden design that would echo for 2,000 years afterward, all the way to the parks built around Beijing many centuries later. What was lost was harder to recover. Dozens of distinct regional styles, dozens of separate philosophical arguments about what a ruler owed the people who built his pleasures, all flattened into the single much larger story of one empire. The nobles who walked their garden paths in the decades before Qin's final campaigns did not know they were tending the last generation of a particular kind of beauty. They knew only that the pond needed clearing, that the deer were thinning before winter, that a rival lord's terrace had grown taller than their own, and something would have to be done about it. They argued with philosophers who told them their pleasure was hollow if it came at someone else's expense. And most of them, like most people in every century, found ways not to listen too closely. They were not thinking about archaeologists who would one day measure their rammed earth in meters, or about historians who would read Mencius's old conversation and recognize their own gardens in it. They were only living, in the most ordinary sense of that word, inside structures that happened to be built from political theology, forced labor, and genuine, complicated love of beauty all at once. If this is what it meant to walk inside the private world the nobility built for itself before the empire, gardens as power, as punishment, as philosophy, as fragile beauty resting on other people's labor, then the harder question waiting on the other side of unification is, what happened when that competitive, fractured vocabulary of terraces and ponds gave way to a single empire's idea of what a garden and a life were supposed to look like?